The church doors stood open to the autumn morning, and inside, 200 guests sat waiting in their finest clothes. Reverend Morrison checked his watch for the third time, smoothing down his vestments as the organist cycled through her repertoire of preludes for what felt like the 100th time. The groom, Daniel Whitmore, stood at the altar in his perfectly tailored suit, his jaw tight with barely concealed irritation as he exchanged glances with his groomsmen. "She's 30 minutes late," his brother Marcus whispered, leaning in close. "What could possibly be taking this long?" Daniel didn't answer. He was beginning to wonder the same thing, and the doubts that had plagued him during the engagement were creeping back in. Sarah was always doing things her own way, never quite fitting into the expectations of his family or their social circle. His mother had voiced her concerns more than once, suggesting that perhaps a girl from the mountains wasn't quite the right match for a Whitmore. Outside, Sarah Mitchell sat in her father's old pickup truck, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the church. Her wedding dress, a beautiful vintage gown that had belonged to her grandmother, pulled around her in the cab of the truck. But her feet were bare, streaked with dirt and small cuts. "We have to go in, sweetheart," her father said gently, his weathered hand on her shoulder. "Everyone's waiting." "I can't, Dad. I can't walk down that aisle like this." She gestured helplessly at her feet. "The shoes are gone. They must have fallen out when we hit that pothole on Mountain Road. I sent Mom and Katie back to look, but they haven't found them yet." Her father sighed, understanding the deeper issue. It wasn't just about the shoes. Sarah had spent the last 6 months trying to transform herself into someone she wasn't, molding herself to fit into Daniel's world. The shoes, a pair of expensive designer heels that Daniel's mother had insisted she wear, had become a symbol of that transformation. Without them, she felt exposed, like the mountain girl she'd always been underneath the polish. Inside the church, whispers had begun to ripple through the pews. Daniel's mother, Patricia Whitmore, sat in the front row with her lips pressed into a thin line. She leaned toward her husband and hissed, "I told you this was a mistake. The girl has no sense of propriety." Just then, the church doors opened wider, and a figure appeared that made the whispers stop entirely. He was massive, well over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway. His beard was thick and unkempt, his flannel shirt rolled up to reveal arms corded with muscle. He wore work boots caked with mud, and his jeans had seen better days. This was Thomas Bear Crawford, a mountain man who lived in a cabin 5 miles up from Sarah's family home, and he was carrying Sarah Mitchell in his arms like she weighed nothing at all. The laughter started immediately, nervous titters from the back pews that grew into barely suppressed giggles as Bear walked down the center aisle with Sarah in his arms. She kept her head high, her bare feet visible beneath the hem of her grandmother's dress, dirt still on her toes. Daniel's face went from white to red as his jaw dropped open in shock and embarrassment. "What is the meaning of this?" Patricia Whitmore stood up, her voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. "This is outrageous." But Bear didn't stop. He walked steadily forward, his boots thudding against the carpet, until he reached the altar. Only then did he gently set Sarah down, careful to make sure she was steady on her feet. He looked at Daniel with eyes that were surprisingly gentle despite his intimidating appearance, then turned to Sarah. "You're where you need to be now," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying in the suddenly silent church. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pair of worn leather moccasins, the kind made by hand with intricate beadwork. "Your grandmother made these for you. Found them in your truck bed. Thought you might want them." Sarah's hands trembled as she took the moccasins. She remembered them now. Her grandmother had made them years ago, telling Sarah to wear them on the most important day of her life. Sarah had packed them in her overnight bag, thinking she might change into them for the reception, but somehow they'd ended up in the truck. As she slipped them on her feet, something shifted inside her. They fit perfectly, soft and comfortable, molding to her feet like they were made yesterday. She looked up at Bear with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Bear nodded, then turned to address the congregation. His voice was rough but clear. "I know what you're all thinking. You're thinking this girl isn't good enough for your world, that she doesn't belong here with her dirty feet and her mountain ways." He paused, and the silence in the church was absolute. "But I've known Sarah Mitchell since she was 6 years old. I've watched her carry water up the mountain for elderly neighbors who couldn't make the climb. I've seen her sit with my mother through her last days when the hospice nurses had gone home. I've watched her pull a family out of a crashed car on Highway 9 in the middle of winter, using her bare hands to break the window because she didn't have tools." He turned to look at Daniel, and there was something in his eyes that made the younger man straighten his shoulders. "The question isn't whether she's good enough for you. The question is whether you're good enough for her." The church erupted in whispers, but Bear wasn't finished. "I carried her in here because she was ashamed. Ashamed that she lost those fancy shoes his mama made her buy. Ashamed that she couldn't be perfect enough for all of you. But Sarah Mitchell doesn't need to be perfect. She just needs to be herself. And if that's not good enough for this family, then maybe she shouldn't be walking down this aisle at all." With that, Bear turned and walked back down the aisle, his boots echoing in the stunned silence. He pushed through the doors and was gone, leaving Sarah standing at the altar in her grandmother's dress and moccasins, her bare legs visible where the hem didn't quite reach the floor. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Daniel stepped forward. His face was unreadable as he looked at Sarah, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in months. He saw the dirt on her feet, the tear tracks on her cheeks, the way she stood there with her chin up despite her obvious humiliation. And he saw the moccasins, worn and handmade, so different from everything in his polished world. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I tried to be what you wanted. I tried to fit in. But I lost the shoes, and I couldn't bring myself to walk in here barefoot, and then Bear found me in the parking lot and just picked me up before I could stop him. And I know this is all wrong and your mother's probably furious, and maybe we should just—" "Sarah," Daniel interrupted, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard in a long time. Something that reminded her of why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place, back when he used to visit the mountains with his friends and didn't care about appearances. "Do you remember the first time we met?" She blinked, confused by the change in subject. "At the river. You were trying to fly fish and kept getting your line tangled." A small smile tugged at his lips. "And you laughed at me. You were barefoot then too, wading in the water, and you showed me how to cast properly. You didn't care that I was a Whitmore or that I came from money. You just saw some city boy who needed help with his fishing line." "That was different," she whispered. "That was before. Before I let my family make me forget who you really are. Before I started trying to turn you into someone else." He reached out and took her hands. "Bear was right. The question isn't whether you're good enough for my family. The question is whether I'm brave enough to choose you over their approval." Patricia Whitmore made a strangled sound from the front pew, but Daniel didn't look away from Sarah. "I love you. Not the version of you that wears designer shoes and knows which fork to use at fancy dinners. I love the you that climbs trees and helps strangers and makes moccasins seem like the most beautiful shoes in the world. But your family will learn to accept you as you are, or they won't. But I'm done asking you to change." He glanced at Reverend Morrison. "If you're still willing to marry us, I'd like to marry this woman exactly as she is. Dirty feet, mountain ways, and all." Sarah felt fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but this time they were different. She looked out at the congregation, at the sea of faces that had been laughing at her just minutes before. Some still looked scandalized. Patricia Whitmore looked like she might faint. But others were smiling now, and in the back pew, she saw Bear had returned. He gave her a small nod, and she understood. He'd known exactly what he was doing, forcing the moment that would make Daniel choose. She turned back to her groom and smiled. "I do still have one condition. Anything. No more designer shoes. Ever." Daniel laughed, a real laugh that seemed to break the remaining tension in the room. "Deal. Though I have to warn you, my mother might never speak to us again." "I can live with that," Sarah said, and she meant it. Reverend Morrison, who had been watching the entire exchange with barely concealed delight, cleared his throat. "Well then, shall we begin? We're already quite behind schedule." As the ceremony proceeded, some guests got up and left, Patricia Whitmore among them. But others stayed, and by the time Sarah and Daniel exchanged their vows, the church felt fuller somehow, even with fewer people in it. Those who remained were the ones who mattered, the ones who understood that love wasn't about perfection or meeting expectations. It was about choosing each other, again and again, exactly as you were. When they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Sarah's moccasins made no sound on the carpet. And when they emerged into the autumn sunlight, Bear was waiting by his truck. He didn't say anything, just gave them both a gruff nod before driving away. Years later, Sarah would tell their children about the day she arrived at her wedding with no shoes, about the mountain man who carried her inside, and about the moment when everything changed. She'd show them the moccasins, carefully preserved, and explain that sometimes you need someone to carry you when you can't walk on your own. But more importantly, you need someone who will love you enough to let you walk barefoot when that's who you really are.